Today is Wednesday, March 19th, 2025. And Ms. Rubin, I noticed that you brought a bunch of materials with you today, and I was wondering if you can tell us about them.
Oh, well, my family came to Great Neck. My great-great-grandfather came to Great Neck in 1891, and his name was Abraham Wolf. And the Wolf family has continually been in Great Neck to this day in 2025. And I'm the fifth generation, and I'm the oldest grandchild that we're aware of from the immediate family. Very briefly, my Abraham had a chance meeting with W.R. Grace, who owned the Grace Shipping Lines and was the mayor of New York between 1880 and 1888. And they met in a hospital where he was recuperating from being thrown from a horse in his horse and carriage. And my great-grandfather, Abraham, was there with my grandfather, Isaac Wolf, which came to be known as I.G. Wolf. And his name, the G, was for Grover Cleveland, who was President of the United States the year he was born. And I also learned something interesting, that Grover Cleveland was the first president that had two non-consecutive terms, just like our present president. He was president between 1885 and 1889, and then again in 1893 to 1897. And he met my great-grandfather, who was in the hospital with Isaac because he had had an accident with his stroller hitting a trolley car in New York City where they lived, and his leg had to be amputated from his knee down. And as the mayor, he was touring in the hospital and talking to people, and he was really struck by the bravery of my grandfather, and started talking to my great-grandfather and found out that he was a tailor. And he said, you know, I have a 154-acre estate in Great Neck. It was almost all of Kings Point. And he said, I'd like to bring you and your family for a healthier life out to Great Neck. And so the whole family came. It consisted of 7 children, my great-grandmother Rose and Abraham. And to get here, it was not easy. There was no trains and no cars. So they actually had to take horse and buggy and then go on a steamboat from Little Neck Bay to Manhattan. And Abraham did that during the summer, but then in the winter they let him stay in New York, and same with Grace. He didn't come out so often. But they had this big place, and then Abraham opened a tailor shop in Great Neck, and there was a fire, and it was burnt down, and it's very close. It's right on Middle Neck Road off Arundel Avenue. The Great Neck that I'm talking about was referred to as the Old Great Neck, and it consisted of Kings Point up to Arundel Avenue and possibly a little further when my great-grandparents lived here.
What was the street that they lived on in Kings Point?
I have it on another piece. Where here, it was.
West Shore Road.
What did you ask me?
He said the house in Kings Point that they came to.
The house they gave him was on East Shore Road, I think right by Arundel Avenue.
Okay.
And it was on 7 acres. And they gave it free of charge at the beginning. And then he was offered to buy it for $7,000, but he didn't take it. And then he realized someone else paid $20,000 for it. So Abraham thought, instead of being a tailor, maybe I should be in real estate. This is good money to be made there. So after his tailor shop burned, he opened up this store, which says on it, it says A. Wolf Real Estate, Fire Prevention and Life Insurance, because there was no fire department in Great Neck. So, forgot about it. So, he decided there had to be a fire department in Great Neck. So we started one. And when he started one in the old village, it was the Alert Fire Department, and it had horses. They needed horses to take the hoses. So there was a bakery in town that lent them the horses until they could round up horses for themselves.
Can I just ask you who's in that picture? Not the fire one, the first one you showed us, like.
This is just a sled, and I believe that's the whole Wolf family. I recognize some of the people. This is just, I believe it's all the siblings, the 7 siblings.
And the street that was on was.
Yes, this was right on Middle Neck Road, right off Arundel Avenue, going towards Kings Point. And so, fire. And then there were 7 children, but 4 stayed in Long Island, and they all were very successful in their business. One interesting story was everybody went to a one-room schoolhouse on Steamboat Road, and I think they went right through high school. I have the time when Arundel was built in the late 1800s, but I think it was before.
What was the name of the schoolhouse?
But my one great uncle, Lewis Wolf, went right from high school, didn't go to undergrad, went right to law school. There was no such thing, I don't know why, but that's how it worked. And then anybody who's been in Great Neck for a long time will remember there was Antoine's Jewelry, and that was one of my great aunts, and that was almost 100 years here, or maybe they celebrated their 100th birthday here. When he passed away, his son took over the store for many years.
And where was that located?
And that was right in the middle of Middle Neck Road, right near Grace Avenue. And it had a big clock outside. It was the only clock in Great Neck. Now there's one at Grace Avenue, but that's where everybody looked for time.
And what was the name of the schoolhouse that was on Steamboat Road?
That was called Alliance or Jewelry. And then Benjamin Ruth was a plumber. And Nettie, which was another child, she married a man who had the first garage in Great Neck, and also Belgrave Motors, which became the first place to buy a car. So, and then my grandfather, these were all great-grandaunt and uncles, which I knew. My grandfather went into real estate. It was I.G. Wolf or Wright. And that was down near the station in, quote, the New Village. So then my grandfather, I.G., even though he had a wooden leg, he started the fire department down there on Cutter Mill Road. And I did some investigating. I said, how come my grandfather, he had a wooden leg that looked like a chair leg. It was just this hump. I said, how the heck can he, do fires? He didn't do fires. He drove the truck and he answered the phones. And you would hear in Great Neck when the volunteer firemen were needed, they would send out this terribly loud shrieking alarm, and I would see my grandfather just get up from his office and go to the fire station. So, and at the time, there were very few Jews in Great Neck, and the Wolves were Jewish. There were 4 churches in Great Neck, all built in the late 1800s. There was All Saints, Spinney Hill Community, and St. Augustine, how do you say it?
Aloysius?
Well, anyhow, but there was no place, and as the second generation was growing, their parents wanted their sons to be bar mitzvahed. So they would go on a horse and buggy ride to Flushing to a temple called the Gates of Prayer. And then they said, we need a temple in Great Neck. So with my grandfather and great-grandfather in real estate, they were able to get the land right at Middle Neck Road and Old Mill Road and founded Temple Bethel. And my great-grandfather was the vice president for life, and my grandfather was the second president. And they started the first temple there, and my mother was in the first Hebrew Sunday school class. And every year until she died, they would have a ceremony each year when the children graduated, and she would get up and they would hold like a wreath, a connecting wreath, and she would always be the first wreath. And so that became a tradition. And to this day, they still have a flower fund where people can donate flowers, and it's called the Rose Wolf Club. And I just made a donation there recently for someone. But education was always very, very important to my family, especially my mother, because she did go to Kensington School, and then she went to the brand new junior high school. There was only one high school right here on Polo Road. And my mother was born in 1916, and as her forefathers, there were no hospitals on the island. So everybody was born in their home or with a midwife. And my mother graduated from Kensington in 8th grade and then went straight to the high school. There was no middle school. And in 1940, she married my dad, Lou Emanuel, and they lived in Little Neck, but they spent most of their time in Great Neck because my mother had so much family here. And he didn't care for Temple Bethel, which was a Reformed temple. He came from an Orthodox family, so he wanted something more observant. So he was with the founding fathers that started Temple Israel in Great Neck. And it was first at a house on Preston Road, and then eventually moved to the location further down Old Mill Road, across from Strathmore, which was where we finally moved in 1949. But when I was born in 1942, I have this that mentions that I was named in the temple, and I was the first child named in the new Temple Israel in Great Neck. And even
sorry.
though
Can you clarify the two oldest temples in Great Neck are Bethel and Temple Israel?
they were the first two.
Oh,
Yeah, and the Wolf family
Mhm.
founded Bethel, and my parents were with a small group that founded Temple Israel.
okay, so they're the two oldest.
There
right
were
now.
two,
Mhm.
but Great Neck was predominantly non-Jewish. There was no diversity. It was all white Christian.
Hmm.
Now, when my mother went to high school, she said there were about 10 Jewish people in the whole school system, and several of them married each other. So it was, it didn't start growing until I came in after World War II. But so my parents moved to Little Neck, and at the time, something that really I found out about that I didn't know is my mother discovered there was community day school, nursery school in Great Neck. But Great Neck was one of the few towns that had a nursery school. Nursery school was not popular in 1945. Women stayed home and watched their children, and they didn't go to school to kindergarten, and some even to first grade. Kindergarten was not mandatory, and some parents thought anything below 6th grade, 6 years old, they should stay home. But my mother decided that I should go to nursery school, and she was reprimanded. Everybody thought she was terrible sending me off to nursery school. And then it got even worse because she didn't have a car. So they had a bus come and pick me up. And people would look out of the window and just shake their head in disbelief, like they were sending me off to war. But needless to say, I loved it, and it didn't do me any harm.
What was the name of the school?
It was called Community Nursery School,
Community
and it
Nursery.
was on Skank Avenue. And coincidentally, when I was in college, the first 2 years of college, we had a very long break, and I was an education major, and you were supposed to get either volunteer or get a job in something that you were interested in, but they wouldn't let you in the public schools until your senior year. So I subbed and volunteered at that community school where I went when I was a freshman or sophomore in college. But the schools in Great Neck were always superb and always known for all it had to offer. And my mother was determined that she was going to enroll me in schools in Great Neck. So we were able to move to school the summer of my 5th birthday in June 1947, and I started the schools in Great Neck. Now, I lived in the same house in Strathmore all the time, but I went to 3 elementary schools because they kept building new ones. I started at I started at Arundel, which actually also had a fire, and I have a feeling the first fire might have been the same one that burnt my great-grandfather's shop, because it was in 1868. Oh no, so that was before. Then the school burnt down in 1869, and then rebuilt in 1990 to 1920. And that school is right at the corner of Arundel Avenue and Middle Neck Road, which now is I think a senior housing. And
And the name was of the school?
it was called Arundel School. And then they built the first high school right next to it. I think it was actually connected by a walkthrough. So that was the first main, brick mortar school in Great Neck.
That was called Great Neck North?
And that was called Arundel. And then in the next 12 years, there were 12 different schools built in Great Neck. Well, that I remember. There might be more. I didn't really know the schools that were past Kensington and going towards New Hyde Park. But, it was right after World War II, and the population was growing, and the big farms and the big estates were all getting broken up into communities. So when I was in 2nd grade, they had built 3 small schools from kindergarten to 2nd grade. One was in Baker Hill, all in the early 50s, which I went to for 2nd grade. And then there was also Cherry Lane and Clover Drive. And so as people were moving in with families, they really built them quickly, and they were supposed to be temporary. And they eventually built, a bigger kindergarten through 6th grade Baker Hill School. And then they completed Saddle Rock School. I watched them build the communities of Baker Hill and Saddle Rock. I remember when it was all woods with one estate on it. And so for 3rd grade, I went to Saddle Rock. I was the first class there. And then the schools, I followed the schools as they got new. Then they built what we call the junior high school, which was something brand new. Now it's called middle school on Polo Road, just a little bit further down from the high school. And while I was in high school, I remember you could buy a lunch for 35 cents, and you could get milk for 2 cents. Don't ask me why, but I remember that. And something else very interesting about Saddle Rock, it was built with aluminum, a lot of aluminum, and they had a very beautiful aluminum staircase running through the middle of the school. And Alcoa Aluminum had built it, and it was just the beginning of TV, and they wanted to make a commercial. So all the 6th graders got $1 to be in this commercial, and we walked down the steps, and it was on television, and we would see the commercial. So that was very big. And we also had air raid drills where we had to go in the hallways and put our heads down and wait. And of course, we had fire drills as well. But before the junior high school, the elementary schools went to 9th grade, and then you went to high school. But now, and the junior high, I remember, was brand new when I went and had a swimming pool. And I was a swimmer. I eventually became a swimming instructor and a lifeguard. And I was in college, I went back there, and I taught swimming at Kings Point Day Camp, which was right on Steamboat Road. So, and they had big athletic fields, which the high school didn't have. So a lot of the high school projects were done down there. And while I was in high school, there were two things in particular, three things. Number one, that we formed a new group called TAPI, T-A-P-I, which means Teenagers Pitch In. And we would go to the city once a month and go to the Henry Street Settlement House, which was with all new immigrants, and take the children around the city to parks and museums and ice skating and everything else. And I remember really enjoying that. And also, they started building the South schools. So when I was in 10th grade, we had double section, which was not easy because the population was just too big, but we did that. And something else, I was speaking to my cousin, she said she remembered that you could go outside on your lunch hour and smoke if you wanted to. So she remembered that. But when I graduated in 1960, but we still have our reunions together. And before I continue, this was a picture of the entire Wolf family. And I could name most of these people if you were interested. And this was a picture of my grandfather. My brother has a bigger picture of him in front of the Kensington Gates in a horse and buggy.
Can you name
and this is my mother's 1935 graduation, and this is mine in 1960. And I also have something that said what colleges everybody went to, and it's really amazing how the schools were wonderful. We were serious students. And one thing our group particularly learned after World War II, we were all told, you know, how terrible the Holocaust was and how everybody lost all their monetary wealth. But if you had a brain, nobody could take your brain away. So you better do well in school. And we all did. We were all very good students. So now, what did I do as a kid in Great Neck?
Could you name the people in that photo for us?
What?
Could you name the people in the photo for us?
Yes. There's Avraham Wolf, I.G. Wolf, his wife Mary Wolf, Benny Wolf, wait a minute, what are their names? All the Wolf, I could give you them.
It's okay.
I have it written down. It's somewhere, I have it. And this is also a very interesting picture. This is from 1912, and this was my great uncle Louis, the lawyer. He was on the football team. We weren't all athletic. We had one athlete among us. But
where was he a lawyer? What was the name of his firm?
I just think it was Louis Wolf. It was in New York, and then he came to Great Neck, and it was upstairs on top of Middle Neck Road in one of the offices. But you have to remember, when I was a child, there was no TV, no air conditioning, no computers, and you know, it was a very different life from today. I remember going to my grandparents, who originally lived on 44 Maple Drive, which was right at the beginning of Great Neck Estates. It's just the first block. No more of the estates was built. When my mother moved, it was born there. But, you know, Great Neck Estates got all built, and then I remembered, not that, but on the other side of Bayview Avenue, they continued Great Neck Estates. And there was a big golf course there as well, which became our home. But the things I remember was my grandparents, Rose and I.G., had a vegetable garden and a beautiful rose garden, and it was on property right across the street from Temple Bethel. I guess when they bought all the land, they bought a house, and so it was, and the house right next to them was Dr. Mullen, an orthodontist, and they both had beautiful roses. That's just where that new apartment building was. They took those two houses. But my grandfather had a lot of land in the back, so he had this beautiful garden. And he also, I think, had the telephone number at the time. The exchange was GR for Great Neck. Great Neck 20035. And I think it was the 35th phone in Great Neck. And it reminded me that when I was a kid, each house, we had a two-story house, so we had two phones, one on the lower level and one upstairs, and they were on a desk, but they were attached to the wall. So we had 4 kids and 2 phones and no privacy. So for my 16th birthday, I pleaded and got a private phone, a new phone number for my sister and I to have in the bedroom, because my parents kept complaining we were always on the phone. And there was also what they called party lines. We did not have them, but a lot of houses had it, where you had to share a phone line with another company, another family. So you had to pick up the phone and listen and be sure nobody from another house was talking. If they were, you were supposed to put the phone down, but we would listen a lot and find out all this very serious gossip. And then just when I was younger, I loved to play hopscotch and play pogo stick, which is getting popular again. It's a pole with a thing, and you shake. And I was a prima ballerina. I went to Miss Bartova's School of Dance for about 10 or more years. And we also used to go get penny candy.
Where was this dance school located?
Florence Bartova was first on a side street of Cuttermill, and then she was on top of a bar on Cuttermill Road, pretty near Maple Drive, across from, near the movies, not too far from the movies. And we would drive our bikes or walk to 2 stores. There was a store called Wiener's that was near Arundel School, near the park, and then another one right at Brokaw Lane. And we would come with a group, and we would have a nickel or a penny, or maybe if you were really rich, a dime or a quarter. And whoever was there was so patient, because we all chose, 5 or 10 or 25 little pieces of candy. So it would be a day's event. That would be our activities after school.
What were your favorite stores to go to growing up?
I have that right here. I love shopping at Camping Campus, and also when the I guess you would call the shopping center near the railroad came in, there was a department store that kept changing names. It was Wanamaker's, and then it was Stearns, and then it was Gertz. And there also was 5 and 10 cent store, which was a lot of fun. That's where we got our first makeup. So we would be there all the time. And we were very happy when Wooddale Pool came in existence. It was a private pool, but before Parkwood came, we had Wooddale Pool on Steamboat Road. And we went to the movies, and I remember for $5, which I'd save from babysitting, I would get 50 cents an hour, and after midnight, $1. So when I saved up $5, we would go to the movies. We would go to Squire's for lunch. A sandwich was $3.75. Then we'd get candy, and the movie, the admission was 50 cents to the movies. We would get a card, a GO card that said we were a student in Great Neck. So for $5, we had a full day. And we also spent time at the record shop. I don't remember the name, but you could listen to records and then buy them.
Do you remember where it was?
Yeah, and that also was on Middle Neck Road down towards the station.
And the name of the movie theater that you went
Oh,
to?
the movie theater. There were the two movie theaters. There was, I read from my mother before I was around, there was a Mayfair movie theater in Great Neck, but I don't know anything about it. And they had a lot of plays and shows, and a lot of movie stars, and Broadway actors lived there. And they actually ran the trains late on the weekends. But I know the Playhouse and Squires, which was still there until very recently. So that's where I usually went. And
What was your favorite movies that you used to see when you were younger?
I didn't hear what you said.
What were some of the movies you remember seeing when you were a kid at those
Well, I
theaters?
remember all the Disney movies when I was very young. And then all the musicals, Carousel, Oklahoma. I really don't remember too much.
And do you remember which celebrities you would see there?
Well, no. When I was born, there weren't any live shows anymore. When my mother was a child, I mean, there were a myriad of people. Actually, when I didn't read everything I wrote, but when my grandfather built Kenilworth, which was, I have a big article about this for you to see, and it was considered very, very elegant and very big, and there were a lot of very famous people that lived there. I remember when I was there were some, but my mother talked about going to school with the five Marx Brothers daughters, and there was The Great Gatsby, and a lot more. But, and as an athlete, I enjoyed all the parks. I went ice skating. We had an indoor ice skating ring in Carmel Road, and
Do you remember the name?
Great Neck Ice Skating Ring. I don't think it was, and it was inside, so that made it different. We could swim on park, on lakes, but I never did. And tennis court over at Memorial and bowling alley. There was one right near the movies that was downstairs that you actually had somebody set up the pins, but then they built a much bigger one near your house where the parking lot is.
Yeah, near Guside Plaza.
Yeah, they built a regular, automatic one, which was
Well, that was
very
Walnut Lanes.
Walnut Lanes, yeah. And, it was amazing, especially to hear the stories from my grandfather, how he built Tustin Court, which was the first apartment building, which is on Old Mill Road up near Old Pond Road, near Old Mill Road. And of course, Kenilworth was really big. There's a big article about it. And I'm just very, very excited that I could share the history of my family with everybody. And this was a picture of my mother and me. And this was a picture of my mother and her sister Ethel Lara. And this was an old picture of my parents when they first moved to Great Neck. And that's about it.
Thank you. One of the questions I had for you is, just since you've been living here, how has the Jewish population grown? What is Judaism? What kind of role has Judaism played in the Great Neck community? And the way the temple played in the
I
community?
forgot a very, very important part of my life. I was trying not to look down so much. After I taught school for several years, I taught in Smithtown and Great Neck, Syosset. I was staying home with my children, and I really wasn't in a hurry to go back to the public schools. and I was offered a job, Temple Israel in Great Neck, which was, the temple that I grew up in and that my parents had found in the nursery school. So I started teaching there in 1975, and all of a sudden, there were a lot of Iranian Jews that started coming over because of what was going on in the Middle East. And so when I was growing up, more and more Jewish families were moving in the 50s and 60s, and the other temples were built, but it really changed. And at the beginning, I remember they did not close the schools for the Jewish holidays, but then some of the teachers were Jewish, so they had to close it because they didn't have teachers. So.
Was there any anti-Semitism that you experienced growing up?
I have to say, I didn't experience any until I got to college. When I got to college, yes, I had a lot. I started off at a very small all-girls school, and again, it was a very elite group. It was almost like a finishing school. People that lived there lived on like Meadow Hill Lane, and they were very, very wealthy people. I felt very out of place, and they had never seen a Jew before, and they looked for my horns, and they asked me once, what did I do on Thanksgiving? I said, I have Thanksgiving, I go and I spend it with my well, we thought that was a Christian holiday. We didn't know Jews would have that. But the schools that I went to became predominantly Jewish. So I didn't feel any anti-Semitism at the time. But
So not in Great Neck?
Not in Great Neck. And then actually I moved to Dix Hills, and I did remember the first year I lived there, we were on a block with 8 houses. There were 4 Jewish families and 4 Italian families. And somebody had put a giant swastika in the middle of the street that took care of 3 of our houses. But when my parents wanted to come to Long Island, there was a lot of segregation. They couldn't move to Port Washington or Manhasset or a lot of others. They were restricted. But I personally didn't feel it.
So my last 2 questions for you. The first one is, do you remember any of the rabbis that were at your temple when you were growing up?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Who played who were very famous at the temple?
Yes. At Temple Israel, we had a Rabbi Waxman, and he was a rabbi for, I think, about 50 years. And he was very, very well known. He talked to the presidents, and he was very involved in anything that had to do. And as a child, David was born May 3rd, 1947. 8, when Israel became a state. And I remember my mother had just given birth, and we all ran over to the temple, and we were singing and dancing and very excited that Israel had become a nation. But he was very influential with national government. And before that,
What was his first name?
Mordechai Waxman. And his wife happened to be an English teacher at Post College, and coincidentally my husband started off his career as an English teacher, and he took lessons from her at Post College. But
What was
there
her
was
name?
also, what was her name? Ruth Waxman. And there was actually, when I taught school there in Great Neck, there was a defined line between before the Iranians came and after the Iranians, because what happened is most of the parents, the women did not speak English, but the husbands did because they worked. So when the children came into my class, they spoke very little English. So they would ask to be put with other Iranian children. So some classes were predominantly Iranian children, and the American children parents started to resent that. So I actually lost a few friends of mine that were going to send their kids to be in my class, and they decided they would go to Temple Beth El, which was our competing nursery school, because the Iranians were more religious and didn't go to to Temple Beth El. But it was a beautiful, beautiful time to be growing up, and you know, it was always a pinnacle to live in Great Neck and go to the schools, and I feel very lucky that we were all here.
What was your address of your house? Like, what was the house number you lived in Great Neck?
We lived at 65 Old Pond Road in Strathmore, just one house away from the pond there, the duck pond. We used to feed the ducks, and we walked to Saddle Rock, junior high, high school, and we could walk into town or walk down Old Mill Road and get a bus. It was an excellent location.
And the last question I had was, if you could just tell us about your experience when they integrated the schools in Great Neck. They integrated the schools.
You know, my brother asked me that. They did that after me. I don't
Okay.
recall having it. There was my schools. I actually was looking at my yearbook. There were a handful, maybe 5 black children in my whole graduation class, and there were a few that were, you know, from South America, or one, you know, it was really almost all white, and by that time primarily Jewish. I think the non-Jewish children, some went to St. Aloysius and then went to the high school in Manhasset, but it became, at least where I lived, was predominantly Jewish when I was growing up. And of course now it's very diverse.
All right, well, thank you so much for telling your story, and we really appreciated having you.